It's 8 o'clock on this Wednesday evening. Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Yvonne Okwara Matole. Our big story tonight is about the much-anticipated meeting that would bring Jubilee and NASA on the same table over the repeat presidential polls. But it failed to discuss the main agenda. The convener, IEBC Chair Wafula Chebukati, said that a bill that was to be tabled in Parliament for further electoral amendments would affect the main issues that stakeholders need to discuss. We understand tonight on The Big Story that the talks will resume tomorrow. So, that is the story that we are following for you. We're going to get as many angles as we can, as well as some information on those amendments that are set to be tabled on the floor of the House. On the program tonight, we have Rafael Tuju, who's the Secretary General of Jubilee Party, and Willis Otieno, who's an advocate, as well as the head of the Raila Campaign Secretariat. Tonight, including our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, who's been working this story from all angles and has the very latest. Later on, we shall be getting news from the former Vice Chairman of IEBC, Lilian Mahirizaja, as well as from Bobby Mkangi, who's a constitutional lawyer. But let us first begin tonight with Sophia Wanuna, our lead reporter on The Big Story tonight. Sophia, it's been a day of a meeting that was much anticipated. So tell us, what happened at the meeting today and why were they unable to reach an agreement today?
Good evening to you, Yvonne. Indeed, that meeting taking off. Finally, are the bombers of Kenya, and one of your guests, Rafael Tuju, was amongst those that are present representing Jubilee. And we heard from Wafula Chebukati, the chairperson, at the end of the meeting, reassuring on one hand Kenyans that in fact the 26th of October repeat presidential poll was still very much on, and all the plans were being put in place and preparations to ensure that that election does kick off, but that they are confident as a commission being able to bring the parties together, that they will be able to resolve the underlying issues. Let's listen to the chairman.
The 26th of October as an election date for the fresh presidential elections, and we are committed to giving Kenyans a free, fair and credible election. Issues like what we are discussing here today, like what's on the agenda, are issues that the Commission believes will be discussed and settled between the parties. And the fact that both parties are here is an indication that the Commission will be able to moderate these sessions and agree on all the issues that are on the agenda before us.
Chairman Wafula Chebukati there, sounding confident, but yet again, Yvonne, as we said, that meeting had to be adjourned because of NASA raising the red flag, indicating that they had received reports that the Jubilee side was seeking to bring changes and amendments to the Elections Act ahead of that repeat poll. And our Asha Mulu earlier in the day spoke to a constitutional lawyer, that's Bob Mkangi, who talked about the ramifications of such changes coming at this particular time. Let's watch.
To that, Sophia, in just a moment. Obviously, you've talked about the ramifications of having changes to the electoral law in the land happening so soon, or rather so close to the election date, which is now less than a month away. But before we get into what he had to say about that, Sophia, I know you've been working your sources on this big story all day. What are they saying about the specific amendments that are set to be tabled on the floor of the House tomorrow?
Quite a number of changes, proposed changes, Yvonne, that we'll perhaps be hearing and seeing more of tomorrow. But what we've been able to gather from our sources so far is that one of the issues this bill intends to cure is in as far as the leadership in the IEBC as a commission, that in the event the chairperson was not in office as well as the vice chairperson, it then suggests or directs that then commissioners would come together and appoint a chairperson who would be able to exercise all the powers of the chairperson up until properly elected or appointed chairperson was in office. And remember, this is important, Yvonne, coming at this particular point, because analysts have been talking and debating about the question if perhaps Chebukati was to resign, leave office at this particular time. He's the only lawyer in the commission. The vice chair would then definitely not automatically take over that position, and it would create a constitutional crisis. So this seeking to cure a situation where the chair and vice chair are not in office, then the commissioners can come together and have one of their own act before one is appointed. Then it goes on to make such changes or propose changes, Yvonne, and as far as how decisions are made at the commission, saying if it's not a decision by all, that is all parties agreeing on a particular issue, then a majority must agree before a decision can be regarded one from the commission. Yvonne, another of those areas we understand is contained in this bill seeking to change the Elections Act 2011. Yvonne, there's a crucial and important aspect as well of the transmission of results, and it says results shall be transmitted, proposes, electronically and manually, but goes on to say where there is a discrepancy between what's transmitted electronically and manually, it is what is transmitted manually that would hold at the end of the day. Other aspects we understand in this bill are regarding who then gets to participate in a repeat election. It says where candidates withdraw in a situation where there are repeat elections and there are more than two candidates, then that repeat election in the presidential level will go on with the remaining candidates. But when there are just two candidates left, like we have in this situation, Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga, and one of the candidates decides to pull out, then the remaining candidate automatically becomes the president-elect, Yvonne. So another proposal there for changes in the Elections Act that is looking directly at some of the issues the country finds itself facing at this particular point. And as far as how the public gets to follow results as they come in, this law seeks to have the IEBC create a system in which those results, or as they come in, can be followed, but they are not final. They cannot be cited, they cannot be the fallback. The final results would be the manual ones coming from the polling station to the constituency level. And also, Yvonne, before I hand it back to you, there's the question of an alternative complementary system of identification of voters. Remember, this time around, we had the Kim's kits having your fingerprints there to be able to identify one as a voter. So this law suggests proposing that there be a complementary system. So those just some of the proposals. Many more. We've just getting to hear some more of what is in that. But before I proceed, I understand we now have that clip by Bob Mkangi, who is a constitutional lawyer, and his thoughts on the ramifications of such changes to the laws in the Elections Act coming at this crucial time, and especially this time around, Yvonne, just under a month to that repeat poll. Let's listen.
If it's bipartisan, negotiated way of making those changes, then I think we can live with that. But if it's coming from one side, using its numbers to make the changes, I think we'll still, at the end of the day, be where we are, in a very contested, controverted election, which going forward, I don't think will be helpful for the country.
All right, so Yvonne, tomorrow is an important day to be able to see what other proposals are contained in this amendment that Jubilee will be bringing to the floor of the House. And NASA saying they do not want to continue with any further engagement before they see what exactly these proposed changes are, because they feel they will have an impact on the discussions. But also important to note, when I interviewed the former vice chair of IEBC, Lilian Mahiri Zaja, Yvonne, she also held the same feelings of this change is not becoming at this particular time, that it is not proper, because remember, even they were kicked out of office and changes were made to the law with just a few months to the elections. You also have the ACK bishops coming out against changes at this particular point. But again, Jubilee does have those numbers in Parliament, so this one will be one to watch. Yvonne.
Yeah, that's right, Sophia. And one more thing about these amendments that will be tabled tomorrow in the House. You talked about the issue of the candidates in an election, and if one pulls out, we've been hearing about a possible boycott of the polls. But there's also perhaps one thing. Does it seek to cure what happens whether all the 8 presidential candidates can then participate in the repeat exercise? We know Ekuru Aukot went to the Supreme Court. That case was dismissed at that level. I think that's been an issue that's not been clear. Do the amendments say anything about that?
Yes, it does. It clearly highlights that in the event where there's just one petitioner who was a presidential candidate challenging the re-election or the election of the candidate that was announced president, then it's only those 2 that would participate in the repeat election. That is the petitioner, if it's just one, and the person elected who is president-elect. But if there are more petitioners and they were all candidates in an election, the presidential election, then they would all be party to that. In this particular case, remember, Ekuru Aukot was not a petitioner but a party. So if these laws were to be passed, then in actual fact, in this particular case, would still have the scenario that IEBC announced, where it's just a race between Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga. So it also does seek, Yvonne, to answer the questions of who actually participates in a repeat poll.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sophia, and for working your sources in getting that for us here on The Big Story tonight. Already getting quite a few reactions on those proposed amendments on social media tonight. We'll be getting to that. Alan Ogere is saying all those draft proposals, from voter identification to transmission of results by Jubilee, are suspect. Well, that's what we do here on The Big Story. We let you in on all of the biggest details that are happening in the day here in the country. So thank you for that, Sophia. We'll try and come back to you for a little bit more on that. But we want to get into our discussion in just a moment now. We will be telling you about all of these raft of demands. We'll remind you about what NASA's irreducible minimums are in just a moment as well. But you are hearing what various people have to say about these proposed amendments and how they are proving to be the stumbling block in the talks that adjourned today with the IEBC. So joining me tonight, let me remind you, Willis Otieno, who's the head of the Raila Campaign Secretariat, as well as Rafael Tuju, who is the Secretary General of the Jubilee Party. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me on The Big Story tonight. I just want to start with you, Willis, your thoughts on the meeting today and what we're hearing, that the proposed amendments are the ones that were the stumbling block today?
Well, if you look at it, Jubilee doesn't seem to be interested in having a genuine conversation on how to conduct the coming elections. And if you see, when the Commission calls parties in good faith to engage in an open discussion, Jubilee decides to start running a parallel process through which they want to do, in my view, what amounts to be unconstitutional acts. They're trying to use acts of parliament to address constitutional questions. Then it beats logic. Why have an open engagement with the Commission when the other partner, who should be having also a more genuine and upward engagement, decides to pursue another alternative that is meant, in my view, to undermine the nature of conversation that the IEBC was convening parties to engage in. And if you look at, from what Sophia said, some of those issues that they're trying to address, those issues are constitutional questions. Jubilee cannot engage in a parliamentary process to address through acts of parliament those constitutional questions. It's even laughable. If you look at the gist of some of the proposed amendments, you're talking about transmission of results, that you want to do manual transmission of results. The Constitution has already set the basic framework that the process must be verifiable. How do you verify a manual system? You only verify using a technological process, which is anchored in statute. You talk about the chairman. They want to say any commissioner. The commissioners will come together and one of them becomes the chairman of the commission. That is actually laughable. How can that be a process when in actual sense, the Constitution has determined who the chairman of a commission is, how that chairman becomes a chairman of the commission and is given specific functions and mandates in that constitution. It is not left for commissioners or an act of parliament to now vest upon commissioners a responsibility to design or to assign functions to a particular chairman of a commission. So in my view, these are all what I call delaying tactics. And more and fundamentally that we must note is that what we are preparing for is a continuation of the last election. So that you cannot change the rules of that engagement midstream. Jubilee cannot purport now to use parliament to change the rules of this particular election as they're trying to do. It is a continuation of what was. They have to choose. Are we having a completely new election or are we having a continuation of the last election?
All right.
If it is a completely new election, then we must have a complete new set of returning officers, complete new set of electoral infrastructure that will be deployed and used in this election. They are opposed to that.
Okay.
They are simply saying, we want to change only part of the laws that seem to favor us, then we go to this election. I want to advise my friends. We're having free legal aid right now at the Milimani law courts. They should go and ask competent lawyers how they're supposed to approach some of these issues, not through what they're trying to do.
All right, Willis, let's hear from Rafael. Rafael, you were in that meeting this afternoon. Delaying tactics, as Willis puts it?
Well, I was kind of disappointed that we were not able to get into the substance of our meeting. When we got in there in the morning, NASA insisted that they wanted more things included in the agenda. We had an agenda of 8 items. We agreed, we told them, put anything you want on the agenda. And they came up with 8 other items, including their irreducible minimums. Then we adjourned to start again in the afternoon for them to come up with their agenda, because we said, look, we're not going to contest it. Let's put everything on the table. So in the afternoon, they came up with more things on the agenda, which included all these things about Al Ghurair, Safaricom, etc. And I was especially very keen to hear what they're going to say about Safaricom, because I know that they have an M-Pesa pay bill number, which they seem to be comfortable with, and on the other hand, they're complaining against Safaricom. But as it were, they got another excuse that there's a parallel activity going on in Parliament. In that particular meeting, we had no powers or any kind of pretenses that we have a capacity to stop what is going on in Parliament. Parliament is an independent institution, just like the judiciary, and you cannot stop them from carrying out their functions. Whatever mischief they're trying to cure, I think we should look at the bill, we should critique the bill. Kenyans should have a chance to hear the points, but should not be the excuse not to have the meeting. So as far as I'm concerned, they were looking for an excuse to get out of those discussions at IEBC. After all, they have been in the public domain saying that they were not interested, and this is from no less than the former Prime Minister. They said they were not interested in engaging with IEBC. The last minute they decided to come in today, I don't know for what reason, to save face, and then they were looking for excuses to leave, and every step of the way they looked for an excuse to leave, and this issue in Parliament was a perfect excuse for them to leave, and they left.
All right, okay. Rafael Tuju, who's the Secretary General of the Jubilee Party, as well as Willis Otieno, who's the head of the Raila Campaign Secretariat. Willis says these are delaying tactics. Rafael says they're not ready to talk. This is not what they wanted to do. They, in fact, introduced items into the agenda that perhaps shouldn't have been there, including some of the issues like transmission from Safaricom. We want to continue with this conversation here on The Big Story, and your feedback is welcome as well, as we have this conversation on those proposed raft of changes that are being proposed to the electoral laws in the country, as well as what will happen with the talks as we go into day 2 tomorrow, when we're just less than 1 month to that repeat presidential poll. We'll be right back.